People go, well, don't worry, the U.S. created the UN and runs all this. Not the U.S., the robber barons. It officially was founded in July 73, but didn't really get funded and didn't have a building until 74, so technically the year before I was born. A pointless factoid, but just correcting myself. Now, joining us till about 40 after, just to look into one area of this, transportation. Notice it was aviation that rolled over to the TSA, taking over, and now it's the model to take over every other sector of transportation and the economy in general under InfraGard, under infrastructure protection of the TSA, with the DEA there stealing money out of your wallet as asset forfeiture seizure. Rodney Stich could do 10 hours with us. I want him to just give us the basic overview today and then come back on in a few weeks for a full hour. Unfriendly Skies is history of aviation disasters, 1959-11. The following could be subjects to breakdown. The series of world record aviation disasters in the United States after the end of World War II. The crash in New York City on December 16, 1960, the world's worst. Salt Lake City crash and his heavy involvement. The reason why the FAA was called the Tombstone Agency. The practice of cover-ups by the political NTSB. And see, once they're corrupt, you can pull a 9/11. Examples. The life and death assessment given to him to halt the serious problems in airline having the most crashes. The web of intrigue that followed. Scandal behind the next world record airline disaster. The PSA airline plunging into San Diego and his role in that. The abandonment of the Federal Aviation Agency where he worked. Scandal behind the bombing and prosecution of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. Scandal behind the downing of TWA Flight 800. The scandal behind the hijackings of 9/11. Lawsuit against the FAA. Lawsuit against the NTSB. And why he wrote books on aviation disasters, 20 of them. Again, just we can't do justice today with him. He'll be back on the Nightly News. Rodney Stich is an American author and former Federal Aviation Authority investigators. His work led him to understand there was major corruption at the heart of aviation business. He was in Iran when the CIA brought down the destabilization of Mohammad Mossadegh to start that whole thing. He joins us now. Rodney, thank you so much for coming on, sir. And, you know, in fact, I've got callers on hold. We'll just do the rest of the hour, and then I'll just have to go to calls tomorrow, or I'll go to overdrive. We'll see what happens, but we at least need 45 minutes. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Alex. That was quite a area you covered there.
Absolutely. Well, you're an amazing individual. Spend a few minutes telling us about yourself, your awakening, and we'll come back and dive into wherever you want to go first.
Well, let me just give you a quick rundown on my background here. I hate to show my age, but I was a naval aviator, a Navy patrol plane commander in World War II. Thereafter, I was a international airline captain, pretty much in all types of operations. And for the purpose of this show, what would be especially interesting is my time flying Muslim pilgrims from throughout the Middle East to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And this is where I found myself into a CIA revolution where I needed a machine gun escort take me and my co-pilot from the hotel out to our plane. And after that period of time, I went with the FAA, and this is at a time when airline disasters were a common event, sometimes every few months. And one of the major air disasters that was occurring was a DC-8 that crashed into the Brooklyn area of New York City. There was a big scandal behind that. Anyhow, the FAA, the safety segment, and we have the political segment too, you know. The safety segment sent me up to a politically powerful airline that was having a lot of crashes, including the one in New York City. And it was more or less life and death assignment. And it didn't take me long to discover the problems And then I came under attack as I tried to correct them. And the attacks were from the political end of the FAA. And during these attacks, 3 more crashes occurred. And crashes are kind of horrific at times. So other inspectors said, look, Rod, you can't fight the system. But if I didn't do something, this would go on. So I did some very unusual things. First, I used the law in such a way that I acted as an independent prosecutor, and there were several weeks of court-like proceedings that followed. But the administrative law judge was simply an aviation ignorant attorney on the staff of the FAA administrator. So he covered up, and then the head of the FAA Sky Marshal program was so outraged by it, he urged me to send a report to the FAA administrator, and he would sign it, which was done. Of course, at this time now, this is a major scandal because we had a number of people die, and here I'm getting, here's all the evidence.
Aviation expert, aviation historian, Rodney Stich, stay there. We're starting at the beginning to understand how aviation has become so incredibly corrupt. For those that don't know, he's an icon in aviation research. And more insane until your whole government collapses. And now look at the FAA today. I mean, famously corrupt. And I want to get into 9/11 with our guest. I want to get into, I mean, he's a famous guy. If you go research aviation disasters, one of the first investigators, World War II vet, pilot, you name it. So he's hired to go in there. Good people in the agency supported him. He'd gotten up to that point. Why were all these planes crashing routinely? And then we'll kind of do a condensed history of where it went during this segment. But then I want to get into 9/11 with our guest and ask where this is all going today. But the crew wants to know, before you finish up on that part, about the Japanese flag behind you, Rodney Stich, WikileaksUSA.org.
Well, the Japanese flag is one that I recovered toward the end of the war. I was flying a 4-engine privateer out of Tinian to a little island called Marcus Island. And I happened to find a flag there, so I brought it back. Incidentally, after the end of the war, I flew for a while for Japan Airlines. And many of my co-pilots were former Japanese wartime Navy pilots. So wow. Here we have the cockpit, and this is even before the peace treaty took effect, and I think it was 52. Here you have Japanese and American wartime pilots in the same cockpit. So it's kind of interesting, I thought.
But the Japanese were pretty honorable. I mean, once the war was over, they didn't generally double-cross, did they?
No. In some ways, I thought they were more honorable than some of the people I ran into in the U.S. government. And I think I even have mentioned that in some of my writings. Incidentally, the 20 books are on all areas of government corruption, based upon what I have, over a period of years, by writing books and being on hundreds of radio and television programs, starting back in 1978.
Oh, I know. I mean, I've read books from back in the 80s and stuff where it'll quote, Rodney Stich. I mean, you've been involved. I should have introduced you as an icon of the liberty movement that a lot of young folks may not know who you are. I mean, what is your view about the planetary situation right now? Let's get a big, wide view, then we'll zoom into aviation. Who's taking over? What's happening? What's your view?
Well, that's an area you're far more qualified than I am, Alex. I've been sticking pretty much to the hardcore corruption that I and others have developed or discovered, and I leave it up to people like you to come up with an analysis of what is behind all this.
It's amazing. This is a short segment, long segment coming up, but let's get back to the point before the break. You're in there. You're the top federal investigator on some of these crashes. You write your reports. You're told basically shut up. But some other folks in the FAA, they support you. They sign the document. It gets sent to the full head of the FAA. Please continue.
Well, what happened then, I sent a letter to the FAA saying I refuse to work under these deadly conditions and I'm resigning. So I then returned to California and I started writing books to inform the public of these things, because everywhere I went, well, I know during all these accidents when I was fighting the system, I notified a number of members of Congress, and this was in about 65. I did get one thing accomplished. They abandoned the Federal Aviation Agency, and then renamed it the Federal Aviation Administration, but it's the same personnel and the same culture. So the crashes continued for a number of years, and they eventually greatly reduced in frequency due to other conditions, improved engines and things like that. However, occasionally, like on 9/11, people don't realize the FAA did have a role in that. But anyhow, what started happening is that I started receiving information from former CIA people that were involved in like...
Hold on, we're going to come right back on that point. Rodney Stich, WikileaksUSA.org. Talk about a hardcore investigator. He's at World War II vet. Stay with us. Is our guest, WikileaksUSA.org. He's the type of guy that we ought to just fly out to Austin sometime to be in studio. I mean, a World War II vet, combat vet, flying around during the Pacific during all that craziness, and then just a consummate whistleblower from the beginning. And then his book that I have read is simply amazing. Unfriendly Skies, his work on 9/11, scandal behind the hijackings of 9/11, TWA Flight 800. He was early on, said that was bull. Of course, it's come out that's bull. The FBI put journalists in prison that exposed it was a continuous rod warhead and the rest of it. I had General Parton on, who developed the continuous rod warhead, the head of Air Force Weapons Development, before he then headed the entire Air Force. We've had multiple former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We've had top admirals, top generals, General Parton. I think about the amazing guests we've had on the show. It's just mind-blowing. We had the former technical head of the NSA, William Binney, on probably 10 times or more, including in studio. I'm not bragging. People keep saying, though, if this was going on in government, we'd hear about it. We do. It does come out. And the reason I'm saying the government's not our enemy is, as bad as the government is and overrun with corrupt interest, on average, people in government are more awake than the general public. Does that mean there aren't giant swaths of bad people in government? Absolutely, it's there. But again, why is Homeland Security saying they're worried about veterans? Because 9 times out of 10, when somebody's really fighting tyranny effectively, it's got to be 9 times out of 10, it's a veteran. Because they at least have some sense of duty, some sense of, even if the war they were in was wrong or partially wrong, depending on which war, it doesn't matter. They're people that are willing to go fight. They're people that aren't cowards. They're people that believe in something. And believing in something is better than nothing in this world. I'm ranting. Okay, Rodney Stich, you've got the floor as best I can. World War II vet, former FAA criminal investigator, in there trying to find out what's happening. You expose it. They refuse to change it, but change the name of the agency. WikileaksUSA.org. Of all these scandals you witnessed, the stuff you saw with the CIA, you said the CIA started to bring you information. You got cut off by the break. Continue there, and then let's segue into 9/11.
Okay. As I started to say, the publicity from appearing on shows and the books started about 20 or 30 years of people coming to me. These are FBI agents who were in key operations, especially in the Middle East, who would report to me, and we were talking back and forth for years about the CIA drug smuggling, October Surprise, Iran-Contra, how we were subverting different governments, and there were even a couple of mafia people. And eventually, we'll probably get into one mafia person who had more to do with being able to prevent 9/11, but that's for a little bit later. But at any rate, with all of this information and seeing the consequences, I felt I had to do something. And I think I should have my head examined for feeling that. But nevertheless, what I did, since I was experiencing cover-ups everywhere, I figured, well, there's a federal crime reporting statute that says if you know of a federal crime, you got to report it to a federal judge or any other federal official. So I figured, well, okay, I'll file a federal action, which I did, a number of them. And that turned out kind of interesting, especially the one I filed just before 9/11, and even more interesting, the two that I filed after 9/11. But anyhow, there's a tremendous amount of information, and I can't understand so much corruption that exists and the total cover-up by the media, and the people are suffering. Just like I go into details on how we generated the hatred in the Middle East, and then I go into the corruption that enabled a series of terrorist attacks to occur. And this is factual. I try to avoid any conspiracy deals.
You just go with what's admitted, which is an incredible amount. Well, let's talk about the particular books and articles where you break down what happened with 9/11 from your perspective and research, your angle, and then leading that into the larger issue of the Middle East and where it's all going.
Okay. Can I give you an introduction on how it could have been prevented? Well,
sure.
First of all, the CIA had a role in that, but that wasn't not a more criminal role. Complicity was involved in that, and that is with the Department of Justice. I happen to have about a 10-year continual communication with a mole in the Al-Qaeda cell. He was a mole in the cell headed by Ramzi Youssef. And being a former New York City Mafia member, Youssef thought he also wanted to undermine the United States. So Youssef started giving him quite a bit of information on Al-Qaeda activities, including information on several planned Al-Qaeda attacks that did occur. And
are you talking about Ahmad Salam?
I'm talking about Gregory Scarpa Jr., whose father was Mafia Capo, and his father and FBI agents in the New York City offices were involved in murders, just as was occurring in Boston. And Boston had a little more publicity. The murders in the New York City offices were pretty well kept quiet by the media. But anyhow, the mole and his New York City attorney was advising FBI agents of the planned attack as he was receiving the information. Well, Washington deep sixed the information, and the reason they did that, they were planning to discredit this young mafia individual who was planned to testify in several murder trials about the murders that his father committed with the help of specific people in the FBI office.
So he was going to expose something like the Whitey Bulger situation, but going on in New York.
That is correct. Since the Department of Justice was planning to discredit the sworn testimony he was given, now they're confronted with the same fellow providing insider information. So apparently they decided to cover up. So the advance information they were having, that they were receiving, was one, the planned bombing or the planned taking down of a airliner departing New York City. The basis for that, they thought, this is what Ramsey Youssef thought, was it would bring about a mistrial. He was undergoing trial for the World Trade Center bombing and the plan of a dozen U.S. airliners in the Middle East. So anyhow, that was the first test. Then the next information, that TWA 800 happened several weeks thereafter. And the next one was the planned bombing of U.S. embassies, and that was covered up. And then, of course, 9/11. So 9/11 then occurred. Now, I go into great details about the 9/11, and I go into how easy it would have been to prevent it. The primary reason for preventing it, for the terrorists being able to get on the aircraft, or the flight attendants had keys. Well, it was obvious to any street thug that all they had to do was get the key from a mostly female flight attendant. They could go in the cockpit and confront the crews. But then the Department of Justice, now that was criminal. So what I did, and after that happened, I filed a federal lawsuit. First, I filed it in federal courts in Washington, D.C. And this is on the basis of the federal crime reporting statute. And they refused to file it, and when they had a mandatory duty to do so. So then I submitted it for filing in New York City, and Judge Michael McCasey, he refused to file it. It wasn't until about a year later when I notified every member of the Supreme Court justices of the latest obstruction of justice by federal judges that then my action was filed. And then within a few minutes, they dismissed it. So they didn't want this information to get out. Now, if you want to go into more details than anywhere, but that's the information I have, actually, that portion of it. In my books, of course, I go into it.
Absolutely. Bottom line, what do you think really happened on 9/11? I mean, we know there was a stand down. We know Saudi Arabia was bare minimum involved. Obviously, I've shown evidence that goes further, but we just go with what we can prove. Now the cover-up has been admitted. They admit the 28 pages. This whole thing should be reopened now when you've got the former head of the commission saying there was a cover-up.
Oh, well, now, incidentally, the 9/11 Commission was pretty well controlled by the same Department of Justice people who were involved in the deep sixing. And I go into quite a bit of details on that, both on the internet site and in books. Now, the areas you talk about, I have no information on that, so I avoid that.
Sure, I understand. Let me raise this. What about the airline that went down right after 9/11? We'll put it on screen for TV viewers. American Airlines Flight 587 that so many witnesses said looked like it had its engine blown off as it took off there from JFK. Do you have any intel on that Airbus 300 situation?
Well, yes, both on the internet site and in my books, I go into that quite a bit. And that was the usual cover-up whereby the NTSB said there was light turbulence when the plane took off, So the tail ripped off. Tails don't rip off that easily. But what I have the statements made by numerous people on the ground. These are professionals, firemen or policemen who report seeing an explosion in the area of the rear baggage compartment. So what happened on that plane? Of course, it took off from JFK, and shortly thereafter, it goes down. The explosion occurs. One or two engines rip off, and the tail rips off.
Well, that's what I was about to say. I remember at the time, it was even in local papers with cops and firemen and citizens saying the plane just blew up, pieces going everywhere in the sky, thousands of feet in the air after takeoff, and then they spin it and go, that's a conspiracy theory. The back tail just fell off. Clearly, this was a secondary terrorist attack, in my view.
Oh, yes, and I agree with that, and I would presume the system did not want to be reflected as having another terrorist attack occur. It would, of course, reflect badly on the system. And the same thing, if the information that I and all of my sources, and we're all professionals, if this was known, the scandal would go far beyond 9/11. Because this, matter of fact, I'll briefly make reference to the fact that I sued a number of the federal judges because of their cover-up, years of cover-up.
Sure. Well, listen, this is what it comes down to, my friend. Let me give out your website for folks, because I'm going to come back and hit a few final calls. Wikileaks, USA.org. Rodney Stich. I want to prepare a bunch of specific questions for you, send them to you ahead of time, because you're an amazing brain, and have you on for a full hour on the Nightly News as part of a special report in the next few